Good afternoon. Could I ask you to take your seats? We'll start in a few minutes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to invite you to take your seats so we can start the session. Welcome to this seventh working session. The topic is fundamental freedoms. First I should introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Croft. I'm the Deputy Head of the Human Rights Department here at the OSCE ODIHR. The topic of today's session is fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. Some of the questions that can be addressed in this session include: what progress has been made to implement OSCE commitments pertaining to freedom of religion or belief? What are the gaps in implementation? What are root causes underlying violations of freedom of religion or belief in the OSCE region? What opportunities exist in the OSCE region to advance freedom of religion or belief for all? What more can be done to assist OSCE participating states to advance freedom of religion or belief for all while ensuring security? And what examples of good practice are there? I'd like to announce that the speakers list has closed. It reached the limit of 50 participants. I'd like to make a few reminders. Speakers may only take the floor in the capacity in which they are registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can be represented. As always, seats in the plenary hall are designated as indicated on signs placed around the table. All participants are kindly asked throughout the session to respect this seating arrangement. Live streaming of the meeting is available. We would like to continue to strongly remind all participants that filming with cameras and video cameras is only permitted by accredited journalists. No other audiovisual recording should be undertaken without the explicit permission of individuals being filmed. I'd like to remind participants that it is expected that interventions are presented in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner. Please kindly submit written statements before the session to interpreters, preferably to document distribution, to ensure that the flow of documents reflects the discussion. The statement should be provided to the documentation desk in front of the plenary hall. We have two introducers to today's topic. It's my pleasure to announce the first introducer, Professor Marco Ventura, professor at the University of Siena and the Fondazione Bruno Kessler. He is also a member of the ODIHR panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief. Professor Ventura, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moderator. And Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here with you this afternoon and share a few thoughts on, as the title of my presentation goes, the value and rights of minority believers in the OSCE region. This presentation is concerned with minority believers and their freedom in the region, and more specifically with extremism-based or tradition-based limitations to minorities' freedom. 5 factors combine in making majorities anxious about religious or belief minority individuals and their communities. First, global cultural exchange and transformation are resented as threatening identities and traditions. Second, global politics challenge national sovereignty in general and the extent and efficiency of domestic rule. They question human rights as universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And they also question the transition to a viable combination of supranational and national and local governance and justice. Third factor, crisis in the economy and security. This crisis encourages stigmatization of minorities as responsible for the crisis and as an obstacle to peace and growth. Fourth, majorities and minorities are highly unstable. Big change within both sides. The religious landscape is rapidly evolving. Fifth, innovation in science and technology, most of all in information technology and artificial intelligence, empowers majorities to an unprecedented degree, while increasing their concern that digital communication will make minorities more connected internationally and thus more powerful. Against this background, I will argue first that freedom of religion or belief is crucial to security and cooperation in Europe with specific regard to minorities. Second, that religious and belief minorities represent a crucial value for the OSCE region to be acknowledged, protected, and promoted. And third, that inherent and instrumental to such value are minority rights, both general and freedom of religion or belief specific. I would then conclude briefly on the interdependence of the value and rights of minorities in Europe. We have celebrated this year the 25th anniversary of the European Court of Human Rights Kokkinakis decision, 93, the first ever whereby a state signatory of the European Convention on Human Rights was found in violation of Article 9 of the Convention. In the decision, judges made the following seminal point. As enshrined in Article 9, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is one of the foundations of a democratic society within the meaning of the Convention. It is, in its religious dimension, one of the most vital elements that go to make up the identity of believers and their conception of life. But it's also a precious asset for atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and the unconcerned. The pluralism indissociable from a democratic society, which has been daily one of the centuries, depends on it. End quote. This text and the related principle capture the historical and conceptual dimension of freedom of religion or belief for all in Europe. Historically and descriptively, the very identity of Europe as well as its national and local components is based on pluralism of religion or belief in a democratic society. Conceptually and prescriptively, no democratic society can exist if one of its foundations, freedom of religion or belief, is not granted to all. As a consequence, minority believers are to be understood as an indispensable part of the European equation, historically and conceptually, descriptively and prescriptively. And here I come to their value. Minority believers and their communities represent a crucial value for Europe, as understood in the European Convention on Human Rights and other international and pan-European instruments, on two accounts. First, they are indispensable to a plural, diverse, and dynamic European society. Second, they are necessary to a rich and flourishing religious environments. On both accounts, the value of minorities is not limited to some of them, but extends to all, big and small, more or less widespread, old or new. Orthodox Christians, pre-Chalcedonian churches, Roman Catholics and Protestants, Jewish of different schools and traditions, Sunni and Shia, Ahmadi and Alevi, Buddhist and Hindus of various traditions, Sikh and Baha'is belong to the same European symphony, as do Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists and Adventists, Scientologists and Pentecostals, and many more. All have been recognized by European institutions and protected by the Court of Strasbourg. In the European perspective, the value of minorities is inextricably linked to the value of majorities, since all majorities in a given land are minorities elsewhere. From such values follows a process of mutual learning. Minorities invite majorities to recognize and welcome their own internal diversity and the diversity of society. Majorities invite minorities to contribute to the common good and the harmony of society. The ultimate value of minority believers is thus that in multiple ways they are precious and indispensable actors of renewal. witnessing and contributing to the capacity of the individuals and communities of the region to perpetuate traditions and identities through a sensible process of cultural and religious change. Such renewal is not only compatible with religious tradition, but it's a peculiar contribution of them and to them, based as it is on a careful, gradual, incremental process of change, balancing traditions and modernity. In fact, such renewal turns out to be an inspiration for our innovation-driven society, whereas majority and minority believers together have a lot to contribute to how to best draw the line between good and bad change, desirable and undesirable change. Now, minority believers do have rights, individual, collective, and institutional. Some rights are not specific to religion or belief. Belonging to this category is the right not to be limited in the personal freedom, private life, and property without an objective and strict justification. Defense rights, right to fair trial, are also crucial rights for minority believers. Some rights are indeed specific to freedom of religion or belief, as a multifaceted human rights embracing individual, collective, institutional, educative, and communicative dimensions. Such right is expressly recognized in international and regional standards and OSCE commitments. Now, under international law, security or national security is not recognized as a permissible ground for restricting the manifestation of freedom of religion or belief. Under freedom of religion or belief, communities are protected against targeting, discrimination, and persecution. In conclusion, minority believers do not possess rights because of and insofar as they have value. Rights are inherent to them. Still, the correlation between value and rights is defining, should be seen as one of mutual enrichment and strengthening. Whenever and wherever minority believers are denied acknowledgement of the value and protection of their rights, it is the very essence of what it means to be European to be at risk, and the very legacy of what Europeans and European nations and peoples conquered over the centuries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I'd like to now give the floor to our second introducer. Mariam Gaftadze is the head of legal programs and a member of the board of directors of the Tolerance and Diversity Institute of Georgia. Ms. Gaftadze, you have the floor.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and my pleasure to be present at this very important meeting today and to introduce my brief speech about impermissible restrictions of freedom of religion or belief in the OSCE member states. Freedom of religion or belief is a fundamental right, safeguarding of which defines democracy, rule of law, and human rights protection level in the countries. All major international human rights instruments guarantee that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, including the right to have, also to exercise freely these rights. Contemporary world faces various challenges, including ones related to religion, exercising freedom of religion, security issues, and so on. Apart from the global processes, countries' internal political and legal environment also has significant influence on the status of freedom of religion or belief. The current speech overviews the root causes of general examples of violation of freedom of religion in the OSCE region, and also if the countries can manage to draw lines between security and freedom of religion, and if in some cases security is used as a tool against freedom of religion or belief. The member states guarantee and declare freedom of religion and belief. However, some of them set various impermissible restrictions, thus neglecting their international obligations and human rights principles. It's obvious that the degree of rule of law and human rights protection differ in the member countries. However, some of them face similar problems and challenges related to freedom of religion or belief. In some countries, dominant religious organizations have special status and privileges, while minority religious groups often face impediments created by the state. Their rights are repeatedly violated, and the communities and individuals are persecuted. Even there where separation of religion and state is declared in the constitutions, in practice there are examples of close interrelation between state and dominant religious organizations. The governments often seek support from these religious institutions for their political purposes and legitimacy. In return, these dominant religious institutions exclusively enjoy special status, privileges, including tax exemptions and state funding. In certain cases where rule of law, principles of tolerance, and acceptance of diversity is low, hierarchization of religious groups, their division as traditional or non-traditional, or by other forms of classification, might further deepen discrimination towards non-dominant religious groups. According to the UN Human Rights Committee, the fact that a religion is recognized as a state religion, or that it is established as official or traditional, or that its followers comprise the majority of the population, shall not result in any kind of discrimination. In addition, a form of exercising freedom of religion, also freedom of association, is obtaining legal personality by a community, religious community. Under the international law, it's not mandatory to have registration or not. There is a freedom to choose to register or not. But due to the fact that various states set various privileges or rights or obligations to the registered religious communities, so it becomes very important for the communities to have legal personality. Sadly, in order to restrict or marginalize some undesirable religious communities, denial to grant legal personality by establishing complicated criteria for registration of religious organizations is often applied by some OSCE member states. Such approach gives the governments opportunity to consider these religious groups as illegal, to ban, to prosecute, and oppress its members. According to the European Court of Human Rights, when the organizational life of the community is not protected by the freedom of religion or belief, all other aspects of the individual's freedom of religion becomes vulnerable. OSCE and the Venice Commission underline the importance of legal personality and offer to the participating states very precise guidelines on legal personality of religious organizations and overview international standards for recognition of religious or belief communities. Another common instrument very often applied by some governments, some states, is denial to issue building permits for the construction of new houses of worship, thus restricting the number of believers to assemble, to worship, to conduct rituals, and to express their freedom of religion and belief. Such practice, of course, goes beyond the scope of permissible limitation and constitutes an arbitrary interference by the state with human rights and fundamental freedoms. One of the challenges in some participating states is violation of religious neutrality in public schools. Also, in certain cases, the negative influence of dominant religious groups in public educational system is obvious. It's often revealed in religious indoctrination, proselytism, and spread of narratives of religious nationalism. Very often, religious and ethnic minority groups are not represented properly in the school textbooks. And for these Toledo guiding principles on teaching of religions and belief is very important, giving the member states very precise and very clear guidelines how the state's educational systems must approach religious diversity and teaching of religion at public schools. And very briefly, I want to underline the problem of security and how the governments use the security as a tool against some religious organizations. In the cases when regrettably we have such cases, examples among the member states by adopting special legislation on, for example, terrorism, various impermissible instruments in practice are used by the states. The governments persecute various religious communities. And here, OSCE and international standards are very clear that the governments must not apply such instruments, and it's impermissible, as my colleague during the previous speech mentioned, restriction of freedom of religion or belief. It's impermissible to be done under the reason of national security. And to conclude, I want to emphasize the unconditional protection and promotion of freedom of religion or belief by the member states is very crucial. However, it cannot be achieved without unequivocal respect for all fundamental rights and freedoms. Civil society is a stronghold of safeguarding these rights, as the freedom of religion or belief is closely interrelated with other rights, especially with freedom of expression, freedom of association and speech. In countries where the civil society manages to mobilize itself and exercise freedom of expression despite restrictions and challenges, freedom of religion and belief and minority rights are more protected in those countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I'd like to again thank both of our speakers for their very thoughtful, comprehensive introductions to today's topic. Now I will give the floor to the audience according to the speakers list. I'd like to inform you that the order of speakers will be displayed on the screens, which will indicate the previous, current, and next speaker. The allotted time for each presentation has been determined by the speakers list, which, as I mentioned, is quite full. So each speaker will be allowed 2.5 minutes, and we'll have to be quite strict with the time to allow all participants who would like to speak to do so. I'd like to make a few reminders to please keep comments brief and to the point, preferably first focusing on your recommendations. Criticism is, of course, welcome, but should be constructive. Once again, participants are not encouraged to read lengthy prepared statements. Statements can be submitted to the Document Distribution Center for further distribution. And as per rules of procedure of the OSCE, a representative raising a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. So with those reminders in mind, I would like to open the floor to the first speaker as indicated on the screen. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. The full text of this statement will be distributed. Madam Moderator, our delegation continues to exercise a particular duty to insist on the centrality of freedom of religion or belief, not because it ignores other freedoms, but because the freedom of religion or belief is the litmus test for the respect of all other human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Holy See is convinced that belief contributes for both individuals and communities to respect for freedom of thought, the search for truth, personal and social justice, and the rule of law, all of which are necessary if there is to be a just relationship between citizens, institutions, and states. Furthermore, the Holy See affirms that the OSCE is bound to reject what may be called a reductionist approach to or understanding of freedom of religion or belief. Such an approach or understanding seeks to privatize religions, to reduce them to the quiet obscurity of the individual's conscience, and to relegate them to the enclosed precincts of churches, synagogues, and mosques, revealing not only a failure to appreciate the true sense of freedom of religion or belief, but also the legitimate role of religion in the public square. The international instruments and OSCE commitments enshrine not only the inviolability of individual conscience, but also the religious dimension in its specificity as a socially organized phenomenon. In this respect, our delegation welcomes again the guidelines on the legal personality of religious or belief communities, which represents a benchmark document. In conclusion, the exercise of religious freedom by all constitutes both an element of personal fulfillment and a contribution to the good of society. Only a robust respect of this freedom can guarantee the free and full development of our society, since the states, through active promotion of religious freedom, foster the growth of people in freedom and in moral integrity. And I thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you. I'd like to now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Andrei Yurash, Director of the Department for Religious Affairs and Nationalities. According to its international obligations, Ukraine on practice for last 2.5 decades implements undisputable principles of religious tolerance and equality of all religious organizations. Ukrainian law in this area was adopted 27 years ago, simultaneously with formation of the contemporary independent state. From the very beginning, it accepted a whole set of principles that guarantee any possibilities for religious organizations and expression. Among them, a possibility for religious organizations to function without obligatory state registration. Second, creating transparent circumstances for free option and free change of religious affiliation on the personal and institutional level. Third, absence of any forms of the state limitations or controlling the activity of religious organizations on in their entire spiritual measure. Fourthly, actual equality of organizations registered according to the existing law, despite any differences between them, including formal and informal measures. At the same time, and unfortunately, we have to stress that all these principles of religious freedom are terribly violates on the Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied by the Russian troops in Crimea and some districts on Donbass. All religious organizations in Crimea are forced to obtain the new registration according to the Russian law, which is based on the repressive, especially after adopting so-called Yarovaya package and totalitarian principles of cooperation between state and religious institutions. So hundreds of congregations have lost their possibility for development and even existence. At the beginning of 2014, Ukrainian officials counted more than 2,000 communities functioning in the Crimea Peninsula. Among them, around 800 were acting without registration. For now, just several hundreds of communities agreed to receive new Russian registration. Situation at the occupied regions of Donbass is even worse. Appointed and controlled by the Russian Federation, leaders of so-called People Republic are trying to repeat the Russian experience and implementing own special laws on religion that presuppose re-registration of the religious organization.
Sorry to interrupt. If you could please try to come to a conclusion.
Just the last point, with a special accent on so-called totalitarian sect, it means almost all communities, especially from the Protestant group, experience complete prohibition in this area, like Ukrainian Orthodox of Kyiv Patriarchate and Greek Catholic Church. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker, please, to take the floor.
Thank you. Recommendations for participating states, OSCE institutions and field operations and civil society could include to mainstream freedom of religion or belief work within an all human rights for all perspective, stressing implementation of all fundamental freedoms, including those of expression, assembly and association. To insist, in line with human dimension commitments, that the most effective step to ensure security is to fully implement those commitments. To use tools such as the Toledo Guiding Principles on Teaching Religion and Belief in Public Schools, the OSCE Guidelines on the Legal Personality of Religion or Belief Communities, on freedom of association, on peaceful assembly, and on the protection of human rights defenders. In 2017, 3 UN Special Rapporteurs in relation to Russia's nationwide Jehovah's Witnesses ban made this statement. The Special Rapporteurs on freedom of opinion and association, on the freedoms of peaceful assembly and association, on freedom of religion or belief, they said, the use of counter-extremism legislation to confine freedom of opinion, including religious belief, expression and association, to that which is state-approved, is unlawful and dangerous and signals a dark future for all religious freedom in Russia. These warnings have been confirmed. From June 2017 onwards, 6 Muslims have been jailed for periods of between 2 and 8 years for meeting with other Muslims without state permission to, in private homes, study Islam, with one or more expounding the works of theologian Said Nursi. Typically, these Muslims pray, eat, drink tea together. Also, Jehovah's Witnesses are increasingly being detained for long periods of a year or more, simply for exercising their freedom of religious belief. At least 50 being investigated on extremism charges, with 21 men and 1 woman so far known to be in detention. Human dimension commitments from the Helsinki Act onwards stress, and I quote from Kiev 2013, the link between security and full respect for the freedom of thought, conscience and belief. We need to implement those commitments. My full statement is on the document distribution centre. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. It's especially appreciated that you began your intervention with your recommendations. I'd like to now invite the next speaker to take the floor.
Thank you. Promoting and defending international religious freedom is a top priority of the United States and this administration. Our goal is to throw open the gates of religious freedom around the world. To help do that, in July, the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, hosted the first ever ministerial to advance religious freedom and issued the proclamation, the Potomac Proclamation and the Potomac Plan of Action. We will host another ministerial on this topic next year. The Secretary and the Vice President both addressed the event. During the ministerial, the United States highlighted one country in particular for its recent progress, and that was Uzbekistan. There's more work to be done, but I look forward to visiting Uzbekistan to urge further action on religious freedom. Unfortunately, some OSCE participating states are undermining the right to religious freedom. The Russian Federation cloaks its restrictive laws and legal rulings in trappings of combating so-called extremism. Russia is also responsible for abuses in occupied Crimea. The Russian occupation authorities arrest, prosecute, imprison, and in some cases torture Crimea Tatar Muslims. We call for an end to these abuses. In Turkey, Pastor Andrew Brunson is under house arrest following his prolonged and unjust detention on baseless charges. The United States continues to call for his immediate release. The Iron Curtain on religious freedom is coming down. The United States will continue to advocate for religious freedom in all its forms all over the world. More religious freedom yields additional benefits too, like less terrorism and more economic growth. It is a good that keeps on giving, and we must and will pursue it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now give the floor to the next speaker.
Distinguished Chairman, colleagues, the problem of human rights violations based on religion appartenance is one of the most acute challenges in modern times. Such an alarming situation very much is dependent on the continuing attempts by some countries to try to attain their own dubious goals by projecting religious problems on society. In this context, we'd like to note that some countries in the OSCE continue to promote the short-sighted policies that have plunged entire regions into chaos in recent times. The ethno-religious result of this course of action is the unprecedented wave of immigrants flooding Europe. But for some, this is not enough, since attempts to continue these social experiments with religion have continued. How else can one explain the years-long outright pressure by the United States exerted on churches and attempts to meddle in the already complex situation in Ukraine without delving into the obvious devastating attempts of this artificially dividing Orthodox congregations in neighboring countries into us and them? Let us ask, do the American colleagues realize the possible consequences of these experiments for the U.S., or do they plan to watch from the sidelines while Europe reaps the fruits of yet another internecine strife, as in Iraq and Libya, where the Muslim population, thanks to the U.S., was thrust into civil war? The role of instigating a schism in the Orthodox Church will give any benefits to the U.S., especially in the long term. Of course, the problems in the OSCE area with regard to religion are not only involve the Orthodox Church. Anti-Semitism is also of alarming rise. The desecration of Jewish cemeteries and synagogues, the rise of neo-Nazism, and the attempts to falsify the history of the Second World War and to revise the outcome of the Nuremberg trial. Overall, trying to, for certain countries, this has now turned into an integral part of foreign and domestic policy. However, in the modern world, trying to create aisles of security will no longer be possible. Our problems can only be solved together. We hope that today's meeting will make a contribution in our collective measures in supporting and enhancing the security of traditional religions and values. And also with regard to the decision from the Council decision in BAL 2014, we hope will also be taken up at the next meeting in Milan. Thank you.
Next speaker, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Madam Moderator, I'm speaking on behalf of the EU member states. The following countries have aligned themselves with the statement: the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Georgia. Madam Moderator, the EU attaches the greatest importance to the promotion and protection of freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief as a fundamental human right, and has made it one of the priorities of its human rights foreign policy. The EU Foreign Affairs Council adopted specific guidelines in June 2013, which contain clearly defined priorities and tools for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief worldwide, including within the EU. With these guidelines, the EU reaffirms its determination to promote freedom of religion or belief as a right to be exercised by everyone, everywhere, based on the principles of equality, non-discrimination, and universality. In doing so, the EU focuses on the right of individuals to believe or not to believe, and alone or in community with others, to freely manifest their beliefs, including the right to change one's religion or belief, or to renounce it. The EU does not consider the merits of the different religions or belief, or the lack thereof, but ensures that the right to believe or not to believe is upheld. The European Union is therefore deeply concerned by the reports of continued systematic persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, including police raids of private homes, intimidation, arbitrary detention, and criminal prosecution. As we have stated previously in many other occasions, all people, including members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, must be able to peacefully enjoy freedom of religion or belief, as well as freedom of assembly without discrimination, as guaranteed by the Constitution of the Russian Federation and Russia's international commitments. Madam Moderator, the full text of the statement, including recommendations and list of countries aligning with the statement, will be distributed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now give the floor to the next speaker.
Игры в автокефалию.
So, as a pre-electoral project, it's possible for a campaign to transform itself into a destabilizing force. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church must respond to this situation. Currently, it's difficult to imagine what would happen if the situation were to continue as such. The Autokefalnia Orthodox Church claims the property of the entire Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but many of those involved in the schism do not recognize this, and it leads to religious conflict. Events in Kiev has shown that despite the fear tactics, it has not been possible for the Moscow Patriarch to attract a majority of believers. The government authorities in Ukraine have supported the local church, and using radical armed formations, they are beginning to seize churches of the Moscow Patriarchate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Poroshenko can declare a military emergency and move the dates of the presidential elections. At the same time, there is an international war opening in which the Moscow Patriarchate is in conflict with the Constantinople Patriarchate. The fact is that this is an international conflict in orthodoxy. The recommendation is that there be rapidly special observers on freedom of religion sent to the region, and the Ukrainian authorities must determine whether they are going to follow the rule of law or not. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Madam Moderator, distinguished delegates, of all the hatreds that tear at our social fabric today, none is more unremitting, more resilient, more adaptable than anti-Semitism. As representatives of B'nai B'rith International, an American-based organization with members in dozens of countries around the world, my colleagues and I have viewed the resurgence of anti-Semitism throughout the OSCE region in recent years with deep anguish. The responsibility of governments, international organizations, and leaders of civil society to confront this phenomenon is becoming increasingly urgent. To do this, we need practical tools. One such mechanism is ODIHR's Words into Action project, which counters anti-Semitism through activities in the areas of education, security, and coalition building. The German government, which has funded this program for the past 2 years, deserves much credit for its support of this vital initiative. Words into Action has published practical guides and provided other resources to assist educators, government officials, and civil society in better understanding and developing strategies to combat anti-Semitism. But the guidelines developed by ODIHR in the areas of education policy and security remain to be implemented by governments. This cannot happen if Word into Action's mandate is not extended beyond the current June 2019 deadline. It is crucial that this work continue, as the need is more pressing than ever. B'nai B'rith calls on the OSCE to continue its support of Words into Action and insists that the OSCE not downgrade the project or diminish its specific focus on anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a unique and uniquely persistent social phenomenon with distinct characteristics and distinct prescriptions for countering it. Now is simply not the time to reverse course on this important effort. Furthermore, the OSCE must continue to affirm commitments made at the landmark 2004 OSCE Berlin Conference on Anti-Semitism and reiterated at subsequent conferences and assess the implementation of those commitments. Finally, we must also strongly reinforce the crucial principle declared at the Berlin Conference, that no political position, cause, or grievance can ever justify anti-Semitism, and make clear that the demonization and delegitimization of the State of Israel is often none other than a pretext for the hatred of Jews themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker to take the floor.
Dear all, if we talk about freedom of thought, let's start first with our own actions. But before reading out this statement, I want to mention that I was threatened to be excluded from this conference if I read out the following. Here, during the HDIM on Tuesday, 3 Tajik human rights activists were attacked by the Tajik delegation in front of the Sofitel Hotel.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you please clarify how this is related to the topic? Could I ask you to please return to the topic of the session, freedom of religion and belief?
I think it's relevant because it attaches freedom of thought. And here are 3 human rights activists who were attacked in the frame of this conference, and there was no reaction by ODIHR and no reaction by the delegation. So I want to address this issue because it's about human rights.
Sorry to interrupt again. The topic of this session is on freedom of religion or belief.
I'm sorry, Madam Moderator. Could you please let her talk, because this is her right for freedom of thought and conscience that she's trying just to realize under the HDMI conference. Could you please let her talk till the end? Thank you.
Yes, sorry, just again to remind you to please stay on the topic of the session. Thank you.
Okay, so 3 Tajik human rights activists were attacked, and Sulaiman Osayev was beaten in the face, which was caught on video. Ordinayev Vaizidin was kicked against the leg, and the Tajik delegation drove intentionally with a car over the feet of Shukati Rakhmatulo, who tried to stop the car from leaving. So the Tajik delegation did neither apologize or was restricted to enter the conference room again. And
I'm sorry to interrupt you once again. We unfortunately can only have interventions that relate to the topic of the session.
but I think I got the response from the NGO, from the civil society, that I'm allowed to speak here. So,
I'm sorry, only the moderator
we call
is
the
able to give the floor
Tajik
for
delegation to
speakers.
officially apologize for the violent acts and to adhere to not tolerate such inappropriate behavior. The organization is supposed to provide a safe platform of dialogue for both member states and civil
I'm sorry,
society.
I unfortunately have to interrupt you and ask you to please conclude your statement because
Okay, I think I made my point. Thank you.
Next speaker, please, on the list. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The United Kingdom fully subscribes to the statement made by the Kingdom of the Netherlands on behalf of the EU member states, but I would like to add a few remarks in our national capacity. The UK is committed to promoting fundamental freedoms and human rights, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief. As chair of the Human Dimension Committee this year, with my delegation, I have devoted meetings to this topic, as we did last year. Indeed, in October 2017, the committee explored issues highlighted for discussion today, namely the link between security and full respect for the freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief, a link that was acknowledged by OSCE participating states in Kiev in 2013. The United Kingdom strongly believes that protecting this fundamental freedom strengthens rather than threatens security. Violations and abuses of the right to freedom of religion or belief are of increasing concern across the region. Our Prime Minister has promised to stand up for the freedom of people of all religions to practice their beliefs in peace and safety. And on the 4th of July, she appointed Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon as her special envoy on freedom of religion or belief, a new role demonstrating the UK's commitment to defending this universal right. Lord Ahmed will be working with our global diplomatic network and international partners to work for change and to respond to suppression of fundamental freedoms. We will promote respect through education in order to eliminate intolerance and break down barriers between communities. Within the UK too, we are committed to building a strong and integrated society where everyone is free to express their religious identity and where respect and understanding are promoted. In conclusion, Madam Moderator, the UK Government is strongly committed to the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief for people of all faiths and of none. Protection of this fundamental freedom not only enhances mutual respect and increases understanding, but it also enhances the stability of our society and our security of our states and strengthens democratic governance. It is strongly in our common interest to protect it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite the next speaker to take the floor.
Madam Moderator, distinguished participants, I speak on behalf of Islamic community in Russia. The rise in religious intolerance fosters the spread of extremist ideology and bolsters radicalism and the threat of terrorism. The true reasons for prosecution has nothing to do with dogmatic traditional doctrine. In fact, criminals use religious slogans and symbols to justify terror. I'd like to draw your attention to the inconsistency of migration policies in European countries. The level of fear of migrants is growing, according to experts. The model for assimilation is not working. On the contrary, it helps radicals to use the idea of religious and ethnic discrimination in order to recruit poorly educated and spiritually weak individuals. Take a look at Russian experience and the model for assimilation. We're almost 200 different ethnicities and a number of religions. We study both in Russian and in our languages, and we live in peace and harmony. Colleagues, while Europe espouses pseudo-liberal values such as freedom, equality, and brotherhood, it discriminates against Russia a priori, placing our country on a lower rank, groundlessly blaming our country for all of its ills. You blindly idealize one main country, but it is precisely this country that unleashed almost all of the wars of the past decades, bringing pain and suffering to millions of innocent people. It is high time that we all open our eyes to this and learn to be honest with ourselves. Only then will the world begin to change for the better. In conclusion, the results of monitoring of religious freedom in the world carried out by experts of the Russian Association for Religious Freedom can be read in our report, which you will find in the foyer. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker, please.
Hi. My name is Rasim Khalilov, and I'm representative of Azerbaijan Bible Society. Today, like many speakers, have very little time, and I would like to address this Honorable Assembly not to verbosity, but with the message about the changes that are taking place in the midst of hearts of people living in this later time, and also about the changes in our beautiful country in Azerbaijan. Briefly about myself. For 20 years, I served as an evangelical pastor of Azerbaijan Word of Life Charismatic Church, and it was not always easy, but all the efforts are rewarded. Today, I'm also operating as a Secretary General of Azerbaijan Bible Society. Together with my colleague here, we are representative of the evangelical Christian minority in Azerbaijan, and today we have something to tell all of you. Azerbaijan is an amazing country, and to understand what happened in Azerbaijan, we just want to invite you to come to Azerbaijan and see what happened really. So there are many problems that are today, so to speak, on the agenda. First and foremost, this is a problem of interfaith relations, interfaith dialogue. For example, we can take this stigma of non-traditional churches, or how they are often called sects and so forth. To have a short time, I would like to invite you today in 6:15 to Opera Hall to host the site event which we are performed. And please welcome, in my option, I think it's so. So all interested persons are welcome to the Opera Hall at 18:15, and food will be prepared for you too. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I represent the law office Drakonta and the Russian Federation, where I stand up for religious values. Many lawyers know that imams and other religious leaders who fall under the assessment of their work, even when the secular law is used, quite often they are found guilty. I express the concerns of many who spoke about Crimea. But the problem isn't just in Crimea. Well, we are sitting here today in Astrakhan jail, Sheikh Mahmoud Malitov, an imam who has been found guilty due to his religion. It's because he was reciting a blessing in the mosque. This religious blessing or prayer was condemned, and he was jailed for 3 years. This has gone to the European Court of Human Rights, and it has even called into action the authorities in the Court of Human Rights in Article 9. We talked about many other countries or America. The problem isn't America. We do have good laws, and they are also in line with European laws and other articles on the right to practice one's religion. But the people and the subjects of the enactment of the law, the people responsible for the implementation of the law do not conscientiously do their jobs. Sometimes the prosecutor really makes decisions based on his own beliefs. That belief may be based on one's own religion. That person might be an Islamophobe, but it is also based on his own moral compass. Nobody really knows the law in and out. Well, this is all very sad, of course. It doesn't mean that we are going to be sitting on our hands. We really do hope that the European community will help us out. There are many problems in Tajikistan. In Tajikistan, it doesn't seem that the presence of the Russian Orthodox Church is not very the president is quite limited there, but many houses of worship in that country are also limited. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker.
Madam Moderator, I'm Giulio Colesi, the President of the European Humanist Federation, whose recommendation is to repeal all still existing blasphemy laws in all the member countries of the OSCE. We are deeply concerned with the widespread lack of attentiveness for the safeguard of some of the fundamental principles upon which the very fabric of our civilization was built. Many of these principles are put at jeopardy by politicians who pose as the guardians of our real identity and tradition, and mainstream politicians are often inclined to come to terms with those claims, thus letting their openly nationalist and populist competitors to impose their narrative and set the political agenda. If trampling on the human rights of minorities is the most evident consequence of the present regressive wave, keeping in force the existing limitations to freedom of thought through blasphemy laws is another and not less relevant one. They have become a part of policies aimed at using the autochthonous traditional religion or whatever other item can be found in each of our country's real or invented tradition as tools of exclusion, as weapons to be brandished against real or supposed minorities, against liberal or progressive believers, and or against the immigrants. But there is also another, more intelligent and apparently more inclusive version of this repeal of freedom of thought when blasphemy laws are extended to protect all religious faiths. As our societies are more and more secularized, many religious leaders demand a renewed public recognition and renewed privileges. And when such claims come from the religious communities newly established in our countries, other long-established churches often try to seize that opportunity to ask for a renewed public role of all religious organizations that would inevitably confine non-believers and maverick believers alike in the position of second-class citizens like the dhimmis in the Ottoman Empire. Repealing all blasphemy laws has become today part of the defense of our open societies. If we don't act consequently, if we appease the high-handed and the intolerant, we should not be surprised if sooner or later Voltaire's writings are prohibited once again somewhere in our countries, maybe in the school libraries as a mere first step. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker on the list to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Religious discrimination in Hungary. In 2011, the new religion law deregistered all but 14 of the more than 350 previously registered religious groups. Apart from the recognized churches listed in the appendix of the 2011 Church Act, all other religious communities previously registered as churches lost their status as churches but could continue their activities as associations. If attending to continue as churches, religious communities were required to apply to Parliament for individual recognition as such. To re-register and gain legal status as churches again, these deregistered groups have to win a two-thirds majority vote of the Hungarian Parliament, which politicized the process, violated the duty of the state to be neutral in religious matters, and engaged in discrimination against minority denominations. By February 2012, the Parliament has denied the re-registration applications of 60 of the 84 previously registered churches that applied, without providing a substantive explanation for their denials. Among those lawfully registered churches, there were denied re-registration were Christian churches, evangelical churches, Pentecostal churches, the Church of Scientology, and Buddhist, Hindu, and Jewish groups. Many of these churches were found to fulfill all the conditions of the religious law, but they were rejected anyway. In spite of a ruling by the Constitutional Court of 2013 finding the law unconstitutional and a decision of the European Court of the Human Rights in 2014 finding the law in a breach of the European Convention on Human Rights, the religion law remains in force to this day. It continues to be used by the government to discriminate against minorities, religious groups, and individuals its target. As a conclusion, the deterioration situation of religious minorities in Hungary constitutes a blatant violation of the right to freedom of religion or belief protected by the United Nations instruments that Hungary has signed and ratified and which it is bound to respect. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker, according to the list.
Thank you very much. Our statement, supported by FOREF in Austria, is about the ban of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia and its dramatic human consequences. Our recommendations. Like all of the main independent Russian human rights organizations, some of which were brutally persecuted by the Soviet Union, we urge the Russian Federation to put an end to the prosecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, to release from custody all those charged with extremism under Article 282.2 of the Criminal Code, to overturn the Supreme Court ruling prohibiting the activities of Jehovah's Witnesses organizations. We also urge all participating states to make the same points and to back them up with bilateral policies that make clear that no democratic state that truly honors human rights can have a normal relationship with the Russian Federation as long as its persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses persists. In the Russian Federation, peaceful and law-abiding Jehovah's Witnesses are being violently detained by security forces who physically and verbally ill-treat them as if they are terrorists based on the government's assertion that their books and teachings, and I quote, undermine confidence in Christian teachings, unquote. They are treated as violent, dangerous criminals and members of an extremist organization. We know of 25 members of this community who are currently incarcerated, all based on the April 2017 Supreme Court ruling that banned all their 395 congregations. One of the prisoners is Mr. Dennis Christensen, a Danish citizen, and the EU should urge the Russian Federation to release him as long as he is not freed. More than 200 Jehovah's Witnesses have asked for asylum in Finland now, fleeing police raids, criminal prosecution, and beatings in Russia. The official persecution of an entire religious community by an OSCE participating state is unique in the history of the Helsinki process. It sets a terrifying precedent as evidence of the failure of this organization to protect human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Nora Detweiler from the Brussels office of the Baha'i International Community, which represents the worldwide Baha'i community. It seeks to contribute to global advancement through offering insights from the Baha'i teachings and the experience of the worldwide Baha'i community in trying to put those insights into practice in support of efforts to address global challenges. The BIC believes that freedom of religion or belief is a cornerstone of our current societies, whether here in Europe or the rest of the world. The pressing needs facing us daily require us to look beyond the legal and institutional frameworks which uphold freedom of religion or belief, as important and essential as they may be. We also need to focus on the crucial role the collaboration of religious or belief communities play in creating a culture in which FORB for all is promoted and upheld. Without religious communities gaining a deeper understanding that their goal should not be merely to tolerate each other or to live side by side, legal and institutional frameworks remain limited in scope. Religious or belief communities need to wholeheartedly work together and collaborate to uphold this right. And for such collaboration to be sincere and meaningful, they need to focus on what unites them instead of on what separates them from one another. They need to converse with each other without a sense of superiority or a feeling of having exclusive access to truth. As protagonists in this process, religions and belief groups need to work hand in hand with each other, and the OSCE participating states need to create conditions in which such a culture is fostered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on the list, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Religious rights in Serbia, starting from a traditional that the right to freedom of thought, belief, and religion is guaranteed in the Republic of Serbia. Everyone is free to express religion or belief by performing religious ceremonies, attending religious service, or teaching. For the Republic of Serbia, the fight against this intolerance, discrimination based on religion or belief, including members of all churches and religious communities, is of key importance. The Constitution of the Republic of Serbia states in Article 1, the state is based on the rule of law and social justice, the principles of civil democracy, human and minority rights and freedoms, and belonging to European principles and values. Article 21 of the Constitution states any discrimination, whether directly or indirectly, on any ground, and in particular based on race, gender, nationality, social origin, birth, religion, is prohibited. The state body in charge of religious issues in the Republic is the Directorate for Cooperation with Churches and Religious Communities, which belongs to the Ministry of Justice. There are 7 traditional churches and religious communities in Serbia, which make up 95% of the total population of our country. In 2006, the state passed the law on restitution of property to churches and religious communities, which regulates the return of seized property that was seized by the communist authorities after the Second World War. The state allocates funds for product activities of churches and religious communities related to construction, education, culture, assistant to clergy and monks, and religious official support for clergy and monks in Kosovo and Metohija, as we ask for protection, religious, cultural, and national identity. The Directorate for Cooperation with Churches and Religious Communities has initiated with the government of the Republic of Serbia the establishment of a sector for interreligious dialogue in order to promote interreligious dialogue between traditional churches and religious communities in Serbia. The religious and abroad in order to interlink different cultures, promote religious tolerance, dialogue, and cooperation with and the protection and promotion of human rights. In this regard, the results of the implementation show that religious rights in Serbia are based on the affirmation of religious and human freedoms and the promotion of the value, significance, and influence of religion in the society as a powerful factor in democratization and the process of European integration of our country. Thank you for attention.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker to take the floor.
Thank you, moderator, ladies and gentlemen. Tajikistan has ratified international agreements on human rights, but often does not fulfill its commitments. With respect to freedom of religion, there are a number of political prisoners in Tajikistan, and if we look at the laws in recent years, which ban certain practices. We see that there is government interference in the lives of citizens. There are decrees as well as recommendations from the president, which are considered to have the force of law and must be fulfilled. One example is the recent recommendations of the Ministry of Education. When we refer in my country to rules regarding uniforms or modes of dressing, this refers only to women and represents gender discrimination. It refers to women working in education, and they are forced to wear skirts of a certain length. If not, they are penalized even by being fired. Ladies and gentlemen, in a country with a majority of Muslims, there is certainly a practice with respect to the dress code for Muslim women. But women should be able to wear whatever they find comfortable. Now, the fact is that women are forbidden by the Tajik authorities to dress as they wish. Another reason for tension in society is the radicalization of youth. Of course, this is of concern. Official statements by the president have noted that belonging to such organizations is a crime. I'd like, in the guise of recommendation, to recall the content of the statement by a migrant who returned to Tajikistan. In Facebook, he criticized the local administration, Janadlich Udarokov, after which there was a case brought against him under the article for Salafitism, and he was detained for 2.5 years. We consider that it's not possible just to wave one hands and dismiss international commitments which have been subscribed to and signed with respect to freedom of belief and expression.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to invite the next speaker to take the floor.
In my comments, I'd like to refer to issues relating to a draft law on amendments and additions to legal acts of the Republic of Kazakhstan on religious activities and religious organizations, now in the upper house of the Kazakh parliament. Since I myself am a delegate and have all qualifications, I'd like to express my concern that in the event that this draft law is adopted, we forecast an inevitable growth in human rights violations and violations of freedom of religion and belief, as well as a multiplication of complaints from religious communities and believers for the violation of their rights and freedoms. This could lead to worsening of the relations between the state and religion. We consider that this is in no one's interest, neither that of the state nor society. The tension created would simply play into the hands of precisely those aiming to destabilize the relationship between state and society and to undermine security in Kazakhstan. It's worth recalling that Kazakhstan has received recommendations from the United Nations, specifically from the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Commission, the Individual Expert on Minority Issues, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, and the Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of assembly and of association. between 2010 and 2015. These recommendations were not only not considered by those who wrote the draft law, they were directly violated with respect to the provisions on human rights and strengthening security. It's obvious, if this draft law is adopted, it will not only put many law-abiding citizens in our country at risk, but it will also have a negative effect on Kazakhstan's image in the world. Our recommendations. In this connection, we recommend that the government of the Republic of Kazakhstan request ODIHR to analyze the draft law and to assess its correspondence with international commitments taken in ensuring religious rights and freedoms. I can provide more details on this topic in my comments, which will be available on ODIHR's website. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker on the list to take the floor.
Madam Moderator, distinguished participants of the conference, today a great deal has been said about the Jehovah's Witnesses who in Russia's right to religion has been flouted. I want to add that in many different regions, the assets of Jehovah's Witnesses is confiscated. Police and administrative pressures are put on them. They are also discriminated against in this way. Also, the children of Jehovah's Witnesses have been persecuted. They are persecuted for the so-called illegal missionary activities. And this notion is very broadly interpreted by lawmakers. Protestant organizations of new religious movements is called up sometimes, but also Jewish organizations are also sometimes charged with this. The anti-missionary amendments have also been extended to the work on the internet. In the long term, this could mean that anyone who mentions a religious organization can be accused of this offense if they do not have a special authorization to do so. The so-called law on protecting the dignity of religious people, we believe also to be illicit. This means that religious minorities are not protected, but only Russian Orthodox followers are supported. Officials themselves are, however, have never taken the initiative to ban this discriminatory law against the Jehovah's Witnesses and to abolish the persecution against these people, to do away with the law of Yarovaya, to review the Protestant organizations out of the list of new religions, also to abolish this amendment that insults religious feelings, which we believe is also very much outdated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Islam is actually quite an old phenomenon in Greece. Muslims in Greece number approximately 1 million, constituting almost 1.2% of the whole population of the country. The Muslim Turkish minority of Western Thrace in Greece, numbering around 150,000 people, cannot fully enjoy their religious liberties. That's to say, as of 2018, they have no right to define their own religious leaders, muftis. Since 1990, Greece has been insisting on appointing muftis while rejecting the ones elected by the Muslim Turkish community, thus creating and promoting a double-headed structure regarding religious representation of the minority at the highest level. Recently, the two appointed muftis have been replaced by new ones, contrary to the minority's reactions. Greece insists on dictating religious leadership to the Muslim Turkish minority on the grounds that muftis have also partial judiciary power based on the Islamic law. Even if it has been applied since the 1923 Peace Treaty of Lausanne, no appointment of muftis had been the case until 1990. This indicates that such appointments are rather political decisions and contravene to the religious autonomy of the minority. Furthermore, religious charitable foundations of the minority face similar problems. That is, administrative boards of these foundations have been appointed by the Greek governments since 1967, and no right has still been given to the Muslim Turks of Western Thrace to define members of these boards. Unlike any other region of Greece, at each and every locality with Muslim Turkish presence within Western Thrace, Mosques and Islamic cemeteries have been unabatedly functioning since 1923, yet there are still some major problems with functioning of these sacred places. Occasionally, they have been targeted by Islamophobic attacks. A recent law that was passed in 2007 and renewed in 2013 foresees the appointment of imams as teachers of the Holy Quran. Even if there have been strong reactions from the minority, no step has been taken yet by the Greek authorities. As Western Thrace Minority University Graduate Association, we urge Greece first to respect the bilateral and international binding documents that has already signed and ratified. Second, stop appointing religious elites and clergy to posts of muftiates, religious charitable foundations and mosques. And third, develop the mechanism of collaboration with the Muslim Turkish minority to find possible solutions for the old and new problems of the Muslim Turkish minority of Western Thrace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
The Mufti of the Crimean Muslims. Morally, it's difficult talking about the violation of religious belief in Crimea, since people are abducted and are disappeared there. All of the different people that I have mentioned, and some of the bodies of these people are also desecrated. Their body parts are sometimes found as well. And nevertheless, this is a list which is far from being exhaustive. There are over 10 victims that I have here, and unfortunately the list grows. If we concentrate on Sheikh Maneli, we will see that the so-called judges in Crimea that consider the case of Article 22 are not trying to establish justice, but are motivated by politics or their own personal relations due to their due to the group of people that the accused is part of. Not only are houses raided to find religious materials, but also other mass raids to check the documents of followers. Sometimes when there are religious holidays, the mosques are raided and blocked and everyone's documents are checked. Many people are taken away to the police to get their fingerprints. Sometimes they have to give a saliva sample to check their DNA. And because this type of information can only be provided voluntarily, as we know. The Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is an organization very clear, talks about use of nonviolence. 25 people have been arrested. Also, we must focus our attention on the administrative offenses that people are charged with. Nikolai Polzov, we talked about him, we talked about Jehovah's Witnesses, but some of this sometimes reaches an absurd state. In January of 2017, Mr. Kireev was fined of $5,000 because he was working with a journalist who invited everyone to take part in some physical exercises. She claimed to be of Russian Orthodox religion. She nevertheless was arrested. I will give my statement to the Secretariat.
Give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you. Basic freedoms, freedom of thought, religion, belief. Unfortunately, in the Russian Federation, the authorities in the past almost 2 decades have consistently carried out a policy of decreasing possibilities of citizens to express their views, to express their convictions, their beliefs, unless these beliefs are in keeping with those of the authorities. The result is criminal persecution, and if in the past this was based on anti-extremist legislation, now this is taking on the character of a large-scale epidemic in which those who are investigating based on statements in social media call or determine that people are extremists. I refer here to general political statements, to religious statements, and the situation regarding the memory of the Great Patriotic War. Now, if in the past these activities took place within the Russian Federation, now they're taking place in Crimea. Recently, there was a parade on Victory Day, and the Crimean Tatars wrote a poem. According to Russian investigators, this poem was not sufficiently accurate in describing the situation, and this led to a case being brought on the basis that there was a rehabilitation of Nazism in these statements, even though that was not the case at all. So, using the instruments of criminal prosecution, the Russian authorities are, in fact, forbidding citizens from expressing their viewpoint and their beliefs. And this means that they are trying to ensure that everyone think and pray in exactly the same way. So this is not in keeping with the recommendations of ODIHR. ODIHR must ensure that the Russian Federation pay attention to this. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker, according to the list, to take the floor.
Distinguished participants, the respect of the rights and freedoms of citizens is the most important thing to maintain harmony in the international community. As in any other country, there are problems, of course, in Ukraine. There's homophobia, there is intolerance and violence, violations of human rights and discrimination. But Ukraine will be able to handle these problems, I am certain. The main problem for us today is discrimination against Ukrainian citizens by the Russian Federation. They curtail their right to live where they want, to move around, to think and say what they want, to express their opinions and convictions. These are the violations that Ukraine has been combating for 4 years. Now, when our citizens clearly state that they're Ukrainian, they are arrested, they suffer in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and in Donetsk and Luhansk. Roman Sushenko, he's claimed to be a spy. Other people are arrested. Oleg Sentsov, 123 days now, is on a hunger strike. And we have had information which is still alarming. Vladimir Vav, who only put out a flag of Ukraine on his house, 170 days of hunger strike. His life is threatened. Hundreds of people are detained in Russia and in occupied Crimea. In Crimea, Crimean Tatars are persecuted en masse. Other people are charged with organizing different acts, and Mr. Belayev has disappeared. No one knows where he is now. The Russian authorities in annexed Crimea is pushing Crimeans towards terror extremism. The activities of many people have been banned in Russia. There is no freedom of conscience, religion, conviction, or thought. Ukraine has many times said that we are prepared to exchange our political prisoners detained on the territory of Russian Federation and occupied Crimea against Russian prisoners, no matter what they are accused of. But Russia has always blocked this. I thank all the participants of the OSCE and the international community for supporting Ukraine in combating the occupying powers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker to take the floor.
I come from Crimea. Maybe you know, this beautiful peninsula. This is one of pearl of our planet. Now this peninsula has become an Iceland of fear. I urge the OSCE participants to do everything to restore freedoms in the Crimea. People are afraid of persecution of their beliefs. The parents are afraid that their children can be stolen and tortured in any moment. Children are afraid that their parents will be arrested home after going to the work. This happened in the Ervin Ibrahimov, Timur Sheymardanov, Islam Japarov, and more than peoples. Many of them are still waiting for the family. A good example of repression and persecution for beliefs is the case of Vladimir Baloch. Simple peoples are afraid of all of this. Even who support Russian Federation first time now afraid they can to do the same. All those who are now responsible, these are inactive. All those who are now responsible, these are inactive in this moment. We use the delegation of the Russian Federation to find the most effective methods are mean to stop the practice in the Crimea. Even crossing the border with the Crimea people need help from relatives and family and publics. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the Republic of Tajikistan places great importance on the issue of the coexistence of peoples of different religions and confessions and beliefs. Currently, in the Republic of Tajikistan, we have the legislative basis to ensure the rights of citizens independent of their race, ethnicity, religion, belonging to a social organization or any social group. The non-discriminatory principle is enshrined in the legislative acts of our country. In keeping with our Constitution, no one religious ideology is recognized as a state religion. A new law was adopted on freedom of conscience and religious and religion, and in drafting this law, due attention was paid to United Nations recommendations. We consider that intolerance or incitement of hatred on the basis of religion to be a crime in this connection. And we also consider the same to be true of any distribution of materials which promote incitement. With respect to the results of the studies on freedom of religion in Tajikistan, we have seen that there are many different religious organizations and that people of many different ethnicities belong to them. I could name just a few of these. There are many both Orthodox and Christian organizations, as well as organizations of the New Apostolic Church, of the Roman Catholic Church, and the Seventh-day Adventists, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses, and a number of other religious organizations, as well as a number of churches of other confessions. This testifies to the fact that all citizens have equal rights in expressing their religion or belief in Tajikistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, according to the list, please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Our surveys have shown the following problems with regard to the human and civil rights in Kazakhstan. First of all, more control over the work of religious organizations, persecution of people due to missionary activities because they haven't registered. Thirdly, major fines for violating the laws in the area of religious activities. There was a high-profile story with regard to Mr. Timur Akhmedov. In 2017, he was accused and sentenced to 5 years in jail due to his religious views. The Supreme Court did not follow the recommendations of the United Nations to free him. However, in 2018, the presidential decree rehabilitated him. A very major problem in Kazakhstan is the expression of one's faith or belief, because this is seen to be missionary activities by the government. Talking about religion in public is not of threat to the social order if everyone involved is interested in the discussion and support each other. However, there are numerous instances when the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, insist on holding these discussions with people. Some people, Muslims, for example, have a duty to respect their religion. And no matter how nice the Jehovah's Witnesses might be, this is a cause of concern. In Kazakhstan, it has been said that there are good conditions in order to ensure tolerance and to enact the tolerant policies of a democratic society in Kazakhstan. However, we do recommend to the government of Kazakhstan to ensure the right to practice one's religion, to abolish certain laws against religion in this area, and to focus on certain bylaws with regard to administrative fines against churches, and to do away with all discrimination against religions in spite of any type of government registration, and to create the conditions for constructive dialogue amongst all religious institutions and the government and any religious associations. The entire report is included in this magazine. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker on the list to take the floor.
I represent the Constantinopolitan Society, a non-governmental, non-profit organization established in 1928 in Athens, Greece, by forcibly expatriated members of the Greek minority of Istanbul. We thank, first of all, the organization and the Italian chairmanship for the opportunity to contribute to a wider focused dialogue on the rights of the economical patriarchate in Istanbul and religious freedom. Our intervention will focus on religious intolerance issues that the ecumenical patriarchate in Turkey is still confronted with. Turkey continues long-standing interferences in the right to freedom of religion or of the belief. The Turkish government has not so far alleviated serious restrictions on freedom of religion, including state policies and suffocating regulations that deny legal personality status to the ecumenical patriarchate as its rights to own, maintain, and manage property, train religious clergy, and offer religious education. I underline that the Ecumenical Patriarchate, of course, is an institution, a respected one, and appreciates more from the members of the Greek minority. As an example, the Greek Orthodox Theological School of Chalki, which had been operating since 1844, the only Greek Orthodox educational institution in Turkey for training its religious leaderships, remains closed since 1971, in spite of the promises of the Turkish government to reopen it. In addition, what is more alarming is the recent announcement by the Turkish authorities to establish an international Islamic educational center on the island of Chalki, of course. Should Turkey decide to carry on with this plan, the Chalki Seminary will be forever marginalized and most likely will never operate again. Therefore, the Halki Seminary should be allowed to reopen for the sake of the community survival, as well as for the survival of the ecumenical patriarchate itself. It is a matter of respect for the freedom of religion. We would like to underline that the respect of religious freedoms is the responsibility of every serious state. It is not a matter that the circulars and statements of good intentions alone can address. It calls for constructive dialogue and common understanding. I would...
sorry to interrupt.
Yes, I'm
the time is
finishing.
getting short.
Just a sentence. The full text of our statements, as some recommendations are posted on the Human Dimension Implementation Meeting official website. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker on the list to take the floor.
The Order of St. Andrew the Apostle once again reports that the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch in Turkey is denied basic religious freedom. The Ecumenical Patriarch for many years has faced a hostile environment which at times threatened its very existence. This is why in 2018, Turkey continues to be on the watch list of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, as it has been since 2013. According to the 2018 report, in 2017, the state of religious freedom in Turkey worsened. The Order of St. Andrew has identified and continues to focus on 5 core issues in its defense of the Ecumenical Patriarch. The 5 issues: first, the Halki School of Theology. The reopening of the Halki School of Theology is a critical step to the restoration of full religious freedom for the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Halki was founded in 1844 and served the Orthodox Christian community until 1971, and then closed due to a law banning private higher education institutions. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom recently issued the following statement: government's continued failure to follow through on the long-promised reopening of the Halki Seminary is disturbing. Denial of legal personality. The Ecumenical Patriarch has no legal identity or personality in Turkey. Confiscation of property and the return of such property. A full paper of this was delivered in the session earlier today, session 6. Non-recognition of ecumenical status. The Turkish government refuses to accept the Patriarch as a leader of 300 million Orthodox Christians worldwide. Rather, he is the bishop to only the remaining Christians in Turkey. Governmental interference in patriarchal election. Governors of Istanbul issued decrees imposing restrictions on the election of the Ecumenical Patriarch and the metropolitans who elect him. These decrees stated that the Ecumenical Patriarch and the hierarchs who vote for him must be Turkish citizens. The number of Turkish-born Orthodox clerics qualified to succeed or vote is dwindling. The canons of the Orthodox Church state that the Ecumenical Patriarch is to be elected freely from all hierarchs of the Ecumenical Patriarchate throughout the world, not just those in Turkey. The order therefore respectively submits that in order to comply with the tenets of the OSCE, to which the Turkish government has committed, that action is immediately taken on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Good afternoon, participants of the working session 7 of the HDIM. I represent the organization of Tajik youth in the Russian Federation. There are more than 40,000 of us currently. I had planned to speak on the 18th of September, but at yesterday's meeting, I determined that I should express my opinion. We are, of course, against all kinds of discrimination or any kind of intolerance, including intolerance on a religious basis, on the basis of beliefs, but it's also necessary to consider that people and groups are following their own selfish goals. Today, we see that the Party of Islamic Renaissance is representing itself as religious and political refugees. Our recommendation to the OSCE, as one of the most authoritative regional organizations, and our recommendation to all participating states is to formulate mechanisms that will make it possible to distinguish between real individuals who are being persecuted on religious or political grounds and those people who are using beliefs in order to carry out crimes in the countries in which they're located. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now invite the next speaker, according to the list, to take the floor. Good afternoon, Madam Moderator. According to the European Court of Human Rights, LB is a Christian convert from Iran. For him, being a Christian means believing in Jesus Christ and telling others about Christ's message of salvation. He has been baptized, studies and recites the Bible, and considers the member of his church as his family. LB is also an asylum seeker in Switzerland. If he is returned to his country, he will likely face ill treatment and possibly death under Iran's apostasy laws. Yet the Swiss authorities recently denied LB's asylum request, finding that applicants who practice their faith discreetly do not face real ill treatment upon their return. The ECTHR affirmed that ruling, thereby undermining the scope of Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights. My name is Jennifer Lee. I represent ADF International, a legal organization dedicated to protecting the rights, the freedoms of religion, assembly, and expression. For ADF International, the rule of law is essential for the protection of human rights. In this case, the various courts' decisions fell short of the standard of law. The legal standard is not whether LB can exercise his religion privately and discreetly. According to Article 9 of the ECHR and OSCE guidelines, the standard grants LB the right to freely and publicly manifest his religion in many broad ways. At the supplementary HDIM meeting in 2017, Professor Marco Ventura, who is with us today, rightfully underscored that religious freedom is in danger of becoming an empty right, not taken seriously, and the scope of religious freedom is increasingly eroded here in Europe. Yet religious freedom is a fundamental human right and a positive cornerstone of democracy, and it cannot be derogated from even in times of public emergency. ADF International is therefore supporting the right of individuals to freely and publicly manifest their religion in worship, practice, and observance. Indeed, religious freedom is a key OSCE objective. Ambassador Koja recently remarked, "The right to freedom of religion provides an indispensable contribution towards promoting stability and security. Respect for religious freedom is a clear indicator of respect for other interlinked human rights, including freedom of association, assembly, and expression." Without adequate respect for the legal standards of religious freedom, OSCE member states will continue to return many individuals like LB to countries where they will face discrimination and persecution. ADF International therefore strongly urges the OSCE to reject a standard of religious freedom that would require individuals to live their faith privately and discreetly and recommit itself to the recognized standard of law, that is, the right to freely and publicly manifest one's religion. Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker on the list to take the floor.
Good afternoon. Soteria International recommends ODIHR and the OSCE member states to explore how to secure the universality of human rights, and especially the freedom of religion and belief, as universal principles rather than culturally explicit expressions. We would also recommend to explore how religion and spiritual systems may provide answers to fundamental human needs and human potentials. At this 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we would like to dare to put the question on what is that universality based. We have today the Human Rights Council's report showing how biased, culturally biased, the interpretation of freedom of religion and belief is. There was a side event here in the lounge where experts, researchers, lawyers, scholars testified and witnessed to how the very definition of what a religion is and how different these questions that we all, I guess we all sit here because we experience this. Some have questions also why freedom of religion and belief needs special protection, apart from the freedom of speech, opinion, assembly, etc. And the question seems relevant also in the light of this very vague definition of what religion actually is, especially when it comes to new religious movements or unfamiliar religious traditions. We would recommend to explore what would happen if the concepts of religion and belief would relate to universal principles at the core of any religion or belief rather than their cultural expressions. It may seem radical, But let's consider the development of universal principles within science, where the practitioners, not the state, the practitioners, the researchers, in organic and ongoing process have practically and by common experience come to define certain unifying and universal principles of science. Just as with science, the state could and should encourage the human potential in religion and belief beyond any fixed and very simplistic perspective of theocracy or secularism, to support the organic development of interreligious discourse and the exploration of universal principles of religion. The state and international institutions would support the integration of religious dimension of human life as a source of prosperity and health. Education, of course, would play a major role in this.
Apologies for interrupting. Could you please conclude?
I conclude. We'll have a side event on this tomorrow, 1:15, in the meeting room 3, and you're welcome to read the paper in the archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Distinguished participants, our secular government is an important condition for the successful development of Kazakhstan. The state policy in the sphere of religion is focused to make sure that everyone's religious rights are equally provided for, but the right to religion should not limit or to stand in the way in the realization of general civic rights of others. The secular laws of Kazakhstan, which strives to ensure the balance of interests of individuals, state, and associations, are different in various spheres of society. The current laws provide for the rights for religion by establishing the balance of social and religious interests and based on partnerships between state and private and religious associations. The concept of the state policy for religious freedom for 2017 to 2020, which established the strategic tasks for public policy. For the strategic guidelines of the concept include a set of measures that implement the state policy in the relations between religious institutions. Kazakhstan has consistently implemented all of OSCE's and other international organizations' recommendations in the human dimension and the rights and freedoms of people. We implement international standards with regard to the full right to practice one's religion. Currently, we are a liberal country in the post-Soviet era with regard to tolerance towards religion and belief. Currently, we have established good conditions for good cooperation. The interconfessional relations in Kazakhstan are a model for other countries today. Many countries visit Kazakhstan to learn on our experience of interethnic cohesion. In October of this year, 10th to 11th, there's going to be the 6th meeting of world religions for the 15 years in a row now in Kazakhstan. We will be holding this major international forum where traditionally over 100 delegations from all countries of the world have participated, where they debate and adopt various measures in order to overcome today's challenges. I still think that we need to solve the issue of religious texts and religious studies. It shouldn't focus on explaining the basis and foundations of religion. It should teach people about religious culture and awareness, and should focus on tolerance and understanding. And this kind of textbook is something that we have drafted and is being tested in schools now. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My delegation would like to take the floor to raise one issue in the framework of freedom of religion, and that is the right of the members of religious communities to elect their leaders and representatives in line with their procedure and practice. The international standards establishes that freedom to train, appoint, elect, or designate by succession appropriate leaders is a part of the freedom to thought, conscience, religion, or belief as stipulated in the UN Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on Religion or Belief. Furthermore, Human Rights Committee General Comment 22 maintains that in addition, the practice and teaching of religion or belief includes act integral to the conduct by religious groups of their basic affairs, such as the freedom to choose their religious leaders, priests, and teachers. The right to elect and appoint religious leaders is particularly crucial for communities who are supposed to enter into consultations and dialogue with the governments on issues related to the return of religious property in places of worship, as it is stipulated also in the OSCE commitments undertaken in Kiev Ministerial Decision. Unfortunately, there are serious violations of freedom to elect and appoint of leaders in some OSCE participating states. This violation is even more unacceptable when it is done towards a religious minority whose status as such is recognized by the international treaty and whose practice and procedure of electing own religious leaders go back to the centuries, or as eloquently put forward by one of our introducers, Mr. Marco Ventura, to the pre-Chalcedonian churches. In conclusion, let me submit one recommendation in this regard. We recommend to the participating states to refrain from impeding the realization of right of members of religious communities to elect their leaders. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite the next speaker to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of Equinet, the European network of equality bodies representing 46 equality bodies in 34 European countries, and would like to draw your attention to the importance of a strong institutional and legal framework promoting equality and tackling discrimination. Equality bodies are statutory public bodies set up by legislation in all EU countries and beyond. Their existence is based on EU equal treatment directives, obliging all EU countries to set up or designate such bodies to promote equality and fight discrimination on the grounds of race and ethnic origin and on sex. While there is currently no EU obligation to set up equality bodies on the ground of religion or belief, the majority of European countries went beyond the EU requirements and mandated their equality bodies to cover religion or belief as well. Analysis of the potential and achievements of equality bodies show that if they are given the necessary mandate, independence, and resources, they can be a highly effective tool in promoting equality and fighting discrimination on all grounds, including religion or belief. Therefore, it is suggested that OSCE participating states that have not yet set up equality bodies consider doing so in order to contribute to better promoting and better promotion and protection of the rights of religious communities and to tackle discrimination based on religion or belief. OSCE participating states that have already set up national equality bodies are requested to ensure that their mandate covers religion or belief in all fields of life and that there are sufficient guarantees of their independence and effectiveness, including staff and financial resources, in line with standards set out by the European Commission and the Council of Europe. The experience of equality bodies on the ground of religion and belief, collected in a number of Equinet reports, most recently in 2017, provides a number of important learnings for this field. First, it is evident that religion and belief are highly debated and politicized topics in today's societies. States continue to grapple with the challenges of striking a balance between freedom of religion of an individual or a group against public safety, public order, health or morals, or the protection of the rights and freedoms of others and living together. Second, there is a need to further legal certainty as the case law on religion and belief of the two courts at the European level and between different countries appear to be utterly contradictory on occasions. Finally, it is of utmost importance that a strong and protective legal framework is in place and is consistently applied in all countries. Equinet's report underlines that even at the EU level there continues to be a gap in protection against discrimination on religion and belief, with only in the field of employment and occupation covered, given the delay in adopting the so-called horizontal directive proposed in 2008, that is 10 years ago. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor now to the next speaker.
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yasim Nurekli from EMISCO, European Muslim Initiative for Social Cohesion. The very fundamental right of belief, worship, and assembly are closely linked to cultural policies run by public authorities. We cannot help but notice that it is shameful that we still have to talk about not restricting these rights in the midst of our vision of law, order, and human rights. This is exactly what Muslim individuals and communities in OSCE region are experiencing their relation to fundamental rights through international cultural policies and political priorities. What happens online and offline in terms of intolerance, discrimination, hate speech, and hate crimes towards Muslim individuals and communities is closely linked to our failure in managing public civility. We expected more focused work on these issues in the OSCE region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the next speaker on the list to take the floor.
Merci. Thank you. In this session, I would like to mention the situation of Muslim minorities in France. The work of our group of research in the University of Marmara has focused on the most important issues of discrimination that have affected Muslims in France and concern many areas of their social life, such as education, the economy, and religion. In France, there is legislation that strictly governs the right to individual freedoms. But in the field, there are many difficulties that remain. Unfortunately, these problems have been exacerbated after the terrorist attacks in 2015 and the state of emergency that was announced and that targeted Muslim minorities and exacerbated tensions between and focused on the difference between ordinary Muslims, violent Muslims, which is basically saying practicing Muslims, and jihadist Muslims. So this confusion is also using the term Salafist as an enemy that must be fought. But Salafism is an orthodox religion, but it is also apolitical and nonviolent. If the state of emergency was lifted in July of 2017, a draft law was adopted in October of 2017 that includes in common law in France most of the anti-terrorist measures. Amongst these are closing mosques, which included broader and vaguer criteria. The free practice of one's religion is very important because it has focused on mosques as possible terrorist cells, and also against those people who have long beards or women who wear scarves, who often are suspected of being radicals. Closing mosques or expulsing imams cannot be a long-term solution, and we think it's very important to understand how and especially why radicalization takes place. We would recommend that, first of all, the authorities should listen to the difficulties facing Muslims, social or economic problems that they're facing, but also issues of recognizing people's identities. Authorities should focus on policies on combating radicalization and terrorism by cooperating with Muslim leaders with regard to mosques in order to ensure the freedom of religion of the Muslim community. And finally, the authorities should reconfirm the fundamental principles of equality and freedom, which have ensured that many generations of Muslims have had very successful social integration. Thank you.
I'd like to now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Merci, Madame la Moderatrice.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I must say that over the course of the last 2 years following the entry of nationalists into the National Assembly, a number of draft laws on religion have been introduced that are increasingly restrictive, providing for total ban on the Muslim religion. What is more, based on the proposal of nationalists at the local level, the Turkish Arabic names of a number of organizations have been changed. We have received a letter from the Health Inspection authorities requesting a decrease in the number of calls to prayer in Sofia mosques and a request that there be restrictions on the Friday prayers. These are alarm signs for the Muslim community in Bulgaria. I cannot leave aside the case on 6th September during the Day of Bulgarian Unification with Eastern Romania. There was profanation of more than and desecration of more than 40 Muslim tombs in the Dobrich Cemetery. I appeal to all of you, dear participants, given this situation, ethnic Turks, Roman Sinti, and Pomak, representing the Muslim community in Bulgaria, find themselves in difficulty. Naturally, these people are treated as a third category. They're told how to act, what to believe, what to wear, and what values to hold. Now, the role that should be played by religious institutions in coming years in order to overcome this illness in our society is the center of our attention. This is an absolute need. We cannot permit nationalists to use minorities as if they were simply game pieces in political games. We must base ourselves on principles. If not, in the future in Bulgaria and around the world, we will encounter increasing problems. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister and the head of religious affairs for their pressure on the nationalists. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm Furkan Senel, speaking on behalf of Think Out. Recognition, enforcement, and cooperation in respect of responsibility and measures for the protection of religion, women, people with disability, and LGBTQI rights are of such a great value. It's very important for governments to be well equipped to overcome the current problems of every type of extremism. We can't give permission to marginal groups to disturb our social stability. We strongly believe that freedom of speech is a condition for a successful democracy, whereas tolerance is essential for the survival of democracy. Unfortunately, this tolerance may not undermine our social harmony and social stability who are in relation with peaceful coexistence. Like always, we are hopeful for positive developments in this area. But we can deviate in 2 points from respect to freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. On the one hand, if it's inciting hatred and violence, and on the other hand, when sympathizing for terror groups. Think Out had warned for these dangerous thoughts 2 years ago at HDM 2016 in the same session. After that, we've seen that Germany has followed our recommendation and has stiffened their law against meetings of terror sympathizers. Think Out's last message, therefore, is, and this is also a recommendation, we need to form a civil front to cooperate with all stakeholders to create a positive sphere in the OSCE region. And the OSCE member states have to follow the footsteps of Germany in fighting against dangerous thoughts such as terrorism. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the next speaker according to the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, dear ladies and gentlemen. The sphere of freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief in Tajikistan over the past year since the last Human Dimension implementation meeting has undergone serious deterioration. Under the pretext of preserving public order and security of the country, the controlling body and the law enforcement agencies violate the rights and freedoms of citizens and involve them in administrative and criminal liability. Receiving religious education is controlled by the government. Imams are often subject to criminal prosecution for adherence
to the religious trend of Salafi or other different from the official Hanafi madhab in Tajikistan. The so-called struggle against Salafism has become a convenient cover for eliminating individuals who criticize local authorities or disapprove of the actions of law enforcement or other state bodies. Accusations of extremism are not only the imams, but also representatives of other faiths. Security forces and law enforcement agencies conduct unauthorized searches in churches, expose members of the churches to interrogation and torture, and exert pressure. Access to information also remains under control. Import and export of any printed materials is not allowed without the written permission of the Ministry of Justice. Action continued against women wearing hijabs and satars. Men in Tajikistan are also harassed and intimidated for wearing a beard. Rights of children also continue to be infringed. The Human Rights Vision Foundation calls on the government of Tajikistan to stop creating restrictions on citizens' fundamental rights and freedom at both the legislative and practical levels, to review the law on freedom of conscience and religious associations and abolish the norms that contradict the international acts, to create democratic conditions for the development of the younger generation. We call upon all international human rights organizations, the OSCE, the UN Human Rights Committee, to pay closer attention and strengthen control over the fulfillment by the Republic of Tajikistan of its obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I'd like to now give the floor to the next speaker, according to the list.
I spoke this morning of laws against blasphemy that are used in order to condemn any criticism of Islam, right up to using the death penalty. I'd like now to denounce the practice of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which is working successfully to obtain globally recognition of the crime of Islamophobia and its transcription into national law, on a par with racism, xenophobia, or anti-Semitism. Now, race is a function of nature, and this is why it would be unfair to criticize or reproach anyone for their race. However, Islam is a cultural identity and presupposes free choice, and thus the possibility of error and of criticism. So how can we explain that Western countries are now applying themselves Sharia at the price of a lie, providing some kind of equality between racism and Islamophobia? This formula assimilates Muslims and Islam as just as true, innocent, and necessary as nature itself. Islam is presented as the natural religion of humanity, and suggesting that a man should be Muslim. I'm quoting the Quran 30:30, as a consequence of which there is a call for eradication, Quran 64. My association calls upon ODIHR to fight against the spread of these sinister generalizations, especially to call upon the Council of Europe to withdraw its report on Islamophobia and its consequences on youth, and to withdraw specifically these statements, and I quote, "Islamophobia can be defined as a vision of Islam altered by prejudice," end quote, or, and I quote, "Islamophobia is a violation of human rights and a threat to social cohesion," end quote. If Christ taught us to distinguish between the natural and the supernatural, which allows us to love even our enemies, truth is the greatest good which we owe to one another. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. In response to the last intervention, I would just like to remind all participants to please adhere to the provisions of the Code of Conduct, particularly the principle of non-discrimination. I'd like to now give the floor to the next speaker on the
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The Ministerial Council of OSCE, in its 20th meeting in 2013, called on participating states to fully implement OSCE commitments on the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. It does not seem that all participating states, such as Greece, respond adequately, since certain religious communities still face obstacles in practicing their religion or belief throughout the OSCE region. The right to freedom of religion of the Turkish community in Western Thrace in Greece has been constantly hampered by several governmental practices and laws, although their religious autonomy is guaranteed by the international agreements such as the Treaty of Lausanne and the 1913 Athens Treaty. The Muslim minority in Western Thrace is granted the right to elect its religious leaders according to the Treaty of Athens. This right was abolished by a presidential decree in 1990. Since then, muftis have been appointed by the Ministry of Education and Religious Affairs. The appointed muftis are not recognized by the members of the Turkish community in Western Thrace, and consequently the community elects its own religious leaders in line with the Treaty of Athens. The religious autonomy of the minority has been undermined, especially with the recent amendments adopted by the Greek Parliament. In January 2018, the Greek Parliament adopted a law which made Islamic law as optional to settle family and inheritance issues of persons belonging to the Turkish community in Western Thrace. The new legislation was drafted once again without prior consultation with the representatives of the Turkish community. The law is another blow against the religious freedom of the Turkish community in Western Thrace. Furthermore, it is contradictory to the Article 13 of the Constitution of Greece, which guarantees the freedom of religion. More recently, a draft presidential decree regarding the implementation of the above-mentioned law has been issued on 2 September 2018, once again without any consultation with the members of the Turkish community of Western Thrace. The draft decree envisages restructuring of Mufti offices in Western Thrace and bringing in a new working system. We would like to highlight that participating states should not interfere in the matters concerning the issues of faith, belief, or the organization of religious group and act in line with the OSCE commitments. Hence, we urge that Greece respect its OSCE commitments on the freedom of religion and withdraw the legal amendments jeopardizing the religious autonomy of the Turkish community in Western Thrace, which is guaranteed by the international agreements. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to request that the OSCE as a whole, and especially ODIHR, to help ensure that the Russian minority in Latvia should respect its fundamental rights for the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, and the fair trial. There have been 14 cases raised in Latvia under political charges against people who were fighting to make sure that Russian schools should remain open, that the ethnocratic Latvian government would like to close. All of these cases are based on public statements, verbal statements, or in the social media or in the press. There are no facts or events.
I would just like to ask you to please, if you could bring your comments to the topic of the session, freedom of religion or belief. Thank you.
I would like to request that the OSCE and ODIHR should send observers to the trials which will be taking place with regard to these cases. One of these cases has no chance. One of these cases will only not win in court, but only if the government of Latvia exerts pressure on the trial. Mr. Alexander Mariaponenko, for 2 months, has been in jail. He unfortunately has become the first person who is being accused under the new Latvian law. This law is called Assistance to an International Organization or a Foreign Power in Actions Against the State of Latvia. And I, unfortunately, am the second person who is infamous in Latvia who has been charged with this crime.
I'd like to ask you about the relevance of your comments to the topic of the session, and please make recommendations relevant to the topic. Thank you.
В агенде написано
In the agenda, it says fundamental rights, the right to expression and the right to belief. In any case, I would like to request that the OEC and ODIHR should send observers to these trials. Thank you.
I'd like to please give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Distinguished colleagues, many discriminatory measures that we are discussing today are targeted to one aim: to create a society of culture. The organization of Muslim religious communities that exist in Austria or Slovakia, language discrimination against Muslims in their religious proceedings in Italy. For example, ensuring that families in families should be forced to assimilate, by basically to turn them into Christians. And for many families, like in Denmark, where people are banned from traveling back to their home countries, and in Ukraine and Latvia, there are also discrimination against minorities. Local communities in France are discriminated against, and many mosques are threatened with being closed. Also, a ban on headscarves is also an attempt to create homogeneous society where people also absolutely don't have the choice whether they will play by the rules of these games or not. What will this lead to? People who don't like these policies have to leave the countries or shut themselves off in ghettos where become the victims of many different radicals. The radicalization amongst minorities is growing. 28% of all minorities are facing this risk. In 2017, the share of Muslims who don't have any contacts with non-Muslims or with the local population in France and Germany was 22%, and in other countries it was up to 38%. I would like to draw the attention of the leadership of the OSCE. Forcing societies to be homogeneous is not the right way to go. We need to have conditions which would provide for the rights of religious minorities and ethnic minorities. There are no binding documents in international organizations that point to forced assimilation. Even the Council of Europe Framework Convention does say that assimilation is possible if it helps integration. Today we need to focus on multipolarity of traditions and cultures, multilingualism. We need to make sure that it is not the majority that sets the agenda, but many different attitudes of different ethnic groups. We need a new convention today, and I would like to draw your attention to this need and to start drafting a new document which could be a barrier against forced assimilation. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the OSCE for giving me the chance to speak here. I'm talking on behalf of members of the Church of Almighty God who are persecuted in China by the Chinese Communist Party and fled to France for political asylum. In China, the Church of Almighty God has always been brutally suppressed and persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. In 2014, the CCP once again conducted a nationwide arrest of Christians belonging to our church, and we were forced to risk our life and flee to France for political asylum. Unfortunately, as of August, 419 out of 444 members of our church applying for status of refugee have been flatly rejected, and 186 of them have received departure orders. These rejected Christians are now in danger of being deported back to China at any time. In January 2018, two sisters whose asylum application had been rejected were stopped by the French police for ID checking, and then they were kept in a retention center, facing the danger of deportation. They showed their church membership attestation and some proof of our church being persecuted by the CCP. French priests also witnessed for them, yet the judges confirmed their decision of expulsion. This makes the other rejected Christians desperate. They live in fear, do not even dare to go out, and their daily life is severely constrained. The CCP has repeatedly issued secret documents to identify the members of our church who have fled overseas. Once church members are sent back to China, they will be arrested and imprisoned for years or even killed.
Wang Aixian, a member of our church who fled to Switzerland and sought asylum, was denied in March 2017 and then was sent back to China. In the same year, she was arrested and sentenced to the 3 years in jail. Now she is still serving her prison term. Yang Shihua, who returned to China from South Korea in May 2018, was arrested upon her arrival at Beijing airport. There are many unfortunate cases like that. We call on the French government to pay special attention to the members from the Church of Almighty God, not handing them over to the persecutors by deporting them to China. At the same time, we call for the support of OSCE to issue our basic human rights in France and other OSCE participants states. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to my speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite the next speaker according to the list to take the floor.
Merci.
Thank you. France subscribes fully to the statement made by the European Union and would like to add a few elements in a national capacity. In France, freedom of religion and belief is something to which we have a great attachment, and it is implemented by the law of 1905, separating church and state. Secularism is not an opinion, it is the freedom to have one. It's neither pro or anti-religious, and it consists of implementing in the area of conscience the principle of freedom, the law ensuring the freedom of religion or of belief to believe or not to believe, to practice the religion of one's choice or not to practice a religion, as well as equality, and that is the equality of all confessions. This presupposes the entire religious neutrality of the state and of public authorities. The state cannot prefer one religion to another and cannot prefer one belief to another. This is why the state does not directly provide funds or support to any religion. And in terms of brotherhood, this is a reference to the fight against discrimination, against incitement to hatred and to violence. Secularism is thus a very powerful factor of social cohesion in France. Secularism does not mean, as is sometimes said, that the state ignores religion. We keep up a constant dialogue with religious representatives on practical issues and on large social issues. Our attachment to freedom of belief guides France in its international capacities as well. We refuse any instrumentalization of a religion through politicization, any incitement to hatred, or any communitarism, or any form of extremism such as radical Islamism, which violates our values. France supports interreligious harmony and encourages the exchange of ideas, university exchanges that will counter the incitement of hatred and ensure a better understanding of the religious phenomenon and help us to fight against intolerance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a Christian of the Church of Almighty God in China, now living in Italy. Thank you to the OSCE for giving me this opportunity to raise the issue of our church members who are persecuted in China by the Communist Party and whose asylum application were rejected in Italy. Recommendations: we urge the Italian authorities not to deport the members of the Church of Almighty God, but to grant them political asylum. None of them has committed any illegal act in Italy. Meanwhile, we call for the support of OSCE to ensure our basic human rights in Italy and other OSCE participating states. In recent years, religious freedom in China has been worsening for all faiths. The fact that the Church of Almighty God is persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party has been progressively known to the world and noticed by several international human rights organizations. However, The asylum application of the church members are massively rejected in Italy. As of August, of 689, only 52 were approved and 308 rejected. A concrete case of the rejections is that Miss Zhang, 31, born in Henan province, was denied asylum in Italy. In 2012, she was arrested for preaching gospel. She was interrogated and threatened during her detention. In 2015, she was forced to flee from China to Italy and apply for political asylum. In March 2018, she was heard by the Milan Territorial Commission of Interior. She gave an account of how she joined the Church of Almighty God and how she was persecuted in China and the practice of her religion in Italy. The Church of Almighty God in Italy investigated and confirmed her membership, but Italy did not recognize her affiliation to the Church of Almighty God and turned down her asylum application. She has appealed the decision. A document leaked to the Western media shows that a new national campaign to eradicate the Church of Almighty God has been launched in 2018. More than 700 were arrested in 3 days for the Seoul Liaoning province. If the applicants were sent back to China, they will be arrested, tortured, sentenced, and even killed. In Italy, there are more than 300 Christians facing the same situation. We appeal to the government of Italy to pay special attention to the members of the Church of Almighty God, not deporting back to China. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to now invite the next speaker on the list to take the floor.
I welcome all participants of the conference. I'm from Crimea, and in 2013, the status of Crimea was changed, despite the fact that the commitments of the Russian Federation, which has practical control over Crimea, relate also to respecting the practice of religion. The fact is that the application of administrative measures is leading to intervention, and the result of this is unlawful searches, as well as in the territory of Crimea, there is a ban on the activity of Hizb ut-Tahrir and Tablighi Jamaat, which are not considered to be terrorist or extremist organizations in Ukraine. The same situation relates to local religious organization Jehovah's Witnesses, which in April of 2017 was also recognized as extremist by the Russian Federation, but they are not recognized as such in Ukraine. As a form of persecuting terrorists, the fact is that there is persecution of all those who are courageous enough to have their own opinions. Emirus Kuku, Severa Mustafaeva, and many other human rights defenders and socially active people are being persecuted. Another problem of all religions is the refusal to register religious organizations in keeping with Russian law. So, 1st May 2015, there was a new registration based on Russian law of only 1% of the more than 500 religious organizations in the peninsula which had Ukrainian registration, and only 47% of these were later registered. The administrative and legal measures are not the only ones being taken. In the territory of Crimea, there are almost 100 people being persecuted according to the Hizb ut-Tahrir case, and they are being sentenced to from 5 to 15 years. Despite that, no extremist material has been found, and despite the contradiction to the information, there has been a recognition of 30 Muslims, and 7 of these have been considered to be extremist organizations. There have been 4 cases of administrative responsibility found on the part of Muslims and some on the part of Christians. What is more, There have been 32 searches with entry into mosques and cemeteries on the pretext of ensuring local security. There's video observation.
Forward to the next speaker on the list. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and distinguished participants. At the outset, let me thank the ODIHR for organizing this session to discuss human rights. Kyrgyzstan focuses on the fundamental issues of freedom of religion and belief as a secular society. In Kyrgyzstan, a religion may be established as an official or state religion. All religions are separated from the state. We guarantee the equality of rights and freedoms of citizens and ban any form of limiting the citizens' rights of belief or religion. The state policy in Kyrgyzstan in the religious sphere, as part of our national laws, and with regard to the implementation of our public policy in religion for years 2014 to 2020, and the plan of action on this front have had very good impacts in developing a multi-ethnic and religious society in Kyrgyzstan, on providing for the protection of interests of believers and non-believers, as well as interagency cooperation and public-private partnership. Our public policy in the area of religion focuses on harmonizing interfaith relations based on secularism and for religious organizations, and making sure that fundamental rights of people and belief are protected, which exclude all forms of discrimination. Currently in Kyrgyzstan, we have 357 religious organizations. Out of these, 286 are of Islam, 319 are Christian. We have one Buddhist, one Jewish community, and some Bahrain. We have also had an interfaith forum in Kyrgyzstan with regard to the interfaith dialogue in Kyrgyzstan, with participants from many religious groups, experts on state and religious relations. In 2018, these fora will be held in all regions of the country. The outcome is going to be Republican Forum at the end of the year, where we will be creating an interfaith council. We can surely say today that we are forming the foundation for dialogue and a social partnership between the state and NGOs. In order to create tolerance amongst youth, the Kyrgyz Republic is planning a project on holding an educational course on religious cultures. In this connection, the State Commission on Religious Affairs is open to cooperation, and my full text will be given to the Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also like to use this opportunity at this point in the meeting to remind those delegations that would like to exercise the right of reply. Those who haven't done so already, please inform the colleagues sitting just behind me. Thank you. I'd like to now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. On behalf of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I would like to share the following recommendations to the OSCE participating states. First, to promote the creation of national human rights institutes or enforce existing ones, providing adequate resources and training on religious literacy and freedom of religious belief for government officials and civil servants. To this effect, the importance of partnerships and collaborations with civil society organizations and churches cannot be overstated. Second, to encourage interfaith and interreligious dialogue among churches and faith-based groups. Similarly, facilitate government-sponsored platforms where religious leaders and civil society can share their privileged view of society and their unique contributions. Third, to consider hosting regional conferences on the topic of freedom of religion or belief, following the example of the Ministerial to Advance International Religious Freedom recently hosted by the United States. Finally, that leaders of the OSCE participating states, churches, philosophical and non-religious organizations set high standards in promoting a responsible and respectful public discourse based on mutual respect and willingness to learn from one another. The right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is far-reaching and profound. It cannot be inherited because it is at the very core of our humanity. One does not apply for it, nor it is granted by any authority, as it belongs to everyone by birth. However, it can and must be protected. Freedom of religion or belief shapes the way we live. It is not a standalone right or set of principles. The link between freedom of religion or belief and other human rights and fundamental freedoms has been broadly acknowledged. Freedom of religion or belief cannot exist without freedom of expression, of association and assembly, as well as other rights which, together, are the requirements for healthy, free, and democratic societies. Religious freedom is as much a duty as it is a right, as much an obligation to give as a privilege to receive. This mutual obligation is the great test of a peaceful society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list. Okay. It seems this speaker is not in the room. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm here. I'm a pastor and a member of the Union of Legal Entities of Union of Pentecostal Churches of Kazakhstan. We in Kazakhstan have we exist as successfully more than 50 different organizations, and we are based on the principle of equality and freedom of conscience. Kazakhstan is experiencing a spiritual revival. There are more than 50,000 religious organizations, many synagogues, and other religious institutions. There are many foreign missionaries as well. The main dates on the Islamic and Christian calendars are observed. There are festivals, and our country is recognized as one large family. Recently, we had the anniversary of a unique assembly of the peoples of Kazakhstan, which has become an instrument for harmony and tolerance on the part of all citizens of any ethnicity or religion. The holding of the meeting of the leaders of the global religions has led to the recognition of the success of our experience. In the process of becoming in the new religious organizations, there are both government monitoring organs as well as the judging of persons who are responsible for any incitement of hatred or intolerance in our country. There have been cases in which there has been insufficient information and in the media, and this has led to false actions on the part of law enforcement authorities. For instance, there was a case brought against the Sources of Life Church, and it was the article in the media that led to this case. The information regarding the diaspora living in Kazakhstan was incorrect.
Except if you could please conclude. Thank you.
So in Kazakhstan on the whole, all conditions exist for successful and fruitful activities of all religious organizations within the framework of the law. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor now to the next speaker on the list.
Mrs. Chairperson, let me start by thanking ODIHR for providing us with the opportunity to exchange views on this important human rights issue. Ensuring that everyone is safe from persecution based on their religion or belief is a responsibility that has to be shared by all members of the international society. Poland firmly believes that freedom of religion or belief is the foundation of any pluralistic and democratic society. This is why we are particularly concerned by the increasing phenomenon of discrimination and religious persecution based on faith in many countries of the world. This freedom has come under severe strain from both states imposing unlawful restrictions on the right to perform religious practices and non-state actors responsible for unspeakable acts of violence against members of religious minorities. Poland, among others, takes steps to assure that the international community's attention is drawn to the situation of Christian communities across the Middle East. Religious freedom, interreligious dialogue, and protections of rights of religious minorities belong to our priorities in dialogue with countries of the region. For example, in Iraq, we encourage religious and community leaders, as well as local authorities, to promote tolerance and coexistence, interfaith reconciliation and implementation of an inclusive peace process to preserve religious pluralism and the multicultural unity of the country. We similarly promote minority rights, especially interfaith cooperation and peace building in Syria. Mrs. Chairperson, we would like to recommend taking following actions: providing an enabling environment for freedom of religion or belief by fostering tolerance and respect for religious and cultural diversity within and among societies, keeping the freedom of religion and belief on the top of the agenda of our cooperation with international organizations, raising the issues of persecution, discrimination and violence towards religious minorities, using and encouraging direct financial contributions to provide humanitarian and development assistance to the members of persecuted minorities, protecting those minority groups that are still suffering from severe consequences of brutal violence that have experienced, and bringing to justice the perpetrators of murders of members of religious minorities and fighting the culture of impunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've unfortunately now exhausted the time available for interventions from the floor. So I would like now to turn to the delegations that have expressed.
Madam Moderator, if I may interrupt you.
The floor to speakers who were on the list. We've now exhausted the time for the speakers list.
It was a mistake during registration. I wanted to speak.
The floor. We have a number of delegations that have requested the right to reply. We need to finish the session on time, so I apologize. I will now go through the list of delegations that have requested a right to reply. The first is Tajikistan. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The delegation of the Republic of Tajikistan, reacting to the information presented today with regard to the violation of the rights of citizens based on religion, would like to note that this is absolutely not true and are targeted misinformation. This person represents the Kazakhstan NGO.
Please. Floor again.
Figures and facts have justified what I've said. Today in Tajikistan, there are almost 4,000 religious organizations. The number of religious associations per capita compared to all of the post-Soviet countries is much higher. For 1,900 citizens, we have one religious group. We have many limitations against women in mosques is something to be dealt with by religious organizations themselves, and the government can in no way influence these limitations. The curtailed rights to religious education are in line with international standards and are created in order to prevent young people to be recruited by terrorist organizations such as ISIL. With regard to wearing of beards and with regard to clothing, there are no laws or standards in the country on this front. We do have a recommendation of the Ministry of Science and Education on clothes that should be worn in places of education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I forgot to mention, please, if the delegations could limit their replies to 1 minute due to the number wishing to use the right of reply. I would like to now give the floor to Kazakhstan for the right to reply.
Kazakhstan's existing legislation includes a package of additions and amendments which have been discussed among experts, and these changes and amendments have been proposed to society, including religious authorities and academics. They've been discussed in all possible fora, including among all 18 religions, the leaders of which have many times discussed these amendments. Now, these amendments are being discussed in the Parliament of the Republic, and for this reason, they have not yet been adopted, and it is the Parliament that will decide in the final analysis whether to adopt these amendments or not. Thank you.
Thank you. The next delegation that has requested the right of reply is Greece. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In reply to two NGO statements, I would like to stress that the process for the appointment of the three muftis in Thrace is fully consistent with the practice followed by other states, including Muslim ones, bearing also in mind that the muftis in Thrace exercise judicial responsibilities alongside their religious tasks. According to recently adopted laws, the jurisdiction of the muftis in family and inheritance law matters of the Muslim minority in Thrace is exceptional and depends on the mutual consent of the parties. This is fully in line with the international treaty protecting the rights of the Muslim minority in Thrace, namely the Treaty of Lausanne, as well as the European Convention of Human Rights and the recommendations of UN treaty bodies. Furthermore, muftis must compulsorily leave their post at the age of 67 in order for the state to program a smooth succession procedure. Finally, the operating expenditures of the muftiate are to be borne by the budget of the Ministry of Education. The above-mentioned measures improve substantially the legal framework of the muftiates and further strengthen the protection of the rights of persons belonging to the religious Muslim minority in Thrace. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you. Next on the list is United States. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moderator. In response to the Russian Federation, the United States is a staunch supporter of religious freedom, including the freedom of members of religious groups to govern their religion according to their tenets. We therefore believe any decision on autocephaly is an internal church matter. If the Russian Federation is wondering what is provoking a schism, it need look no further than its own invasion of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Next delegation is France. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just a couple of clarifications after hearing the presentation from the University of Marmara. Islam today is the second religion of France. Muslims of France, as other followers, obviously benefit from the freedom of practicing their religion under Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Secondly, France combating all hate speech and calls to violence, of course, as well as anything that's targeting Muslims and all forms of discrimination and degrading stereotypes. Thirdly, the authorities of France have a very trust-based dialogue with the Muslim authorities with regard to their religion, with regard to security of mosques and other major topics of society. Fourth, France was hit by these major terrible terrorist attacks, and they were, of course, condemned by the majority of Muslims of France. It is up to the authorities to combat terrorism, and efforts have never waned in combating stereotypes. Fifth, on the 30th of October, the law of 2017 in combating terrorism gives us opportunities to focus on any organization that foments hatred or plans terrorist acts. This is a fundamental measure which is submitted to the independent control of justice while respecting all provisions of the state or the rule of law. Thank you.
Bulgaria, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to use my right in response to the statement made by the Bulgarian Grand Mufti. I would like to inform you that in the period January 2017, June 2018, the state budget subsidized construction and reconstruction activities of over 100 mosques and spent more than 5,000 €100 for the reconstruction of places of worship and administrative buildings of Muslims, Catholics, Jews, Armenians, Protestant, and other religions. For the same period, the Specialized Religious Denomination Directorate within the Council of Ministers also assisted financially the publication of the books, volumes, and religious literature, scientific, psychological studies on various beliefs in Bulgaria. The proposed amendments to the current legal framework on religious denomination in Bulgaria are still pending in the Parliament, and discussion on the proposed changes have not started yet. Thus, it is premature to comment at this stage. Finally, in Bulgaria, there are around 1,800 mosques and places of worships. And taking into account the number of the Bulgarian Muslims, this means that there are one place of worship per 450 Muslims. In conclusion, I disagree with the misleading statements that Bulgaria is considering to impose a total ban of Muslim religion. I thank you.
Thank you. Next delegation exercising right of reply is Latvia. Please, you have the floor.
Dear moderator, I'm not in favor to run into the competition of repeating statements, but I'm forced to do so. In reply to the Russian school defense stuff, first, I would like to join to the delegations and the moderator to request to keep on each day's topic. Unfortunately, it was not heard so far. Second, Latvia strictly adheres to the rule of law principle and always respect the principle of presumption of innocence. We trust our courts. Third, Mr. Kozyreus is member of one political party and is running for the general elections in a couple of weeks. I regret attempts by an active politician to use this forum as part of pre-election campaign. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 3 delegations still on the list: Switzerland, Italy, and Ukraine. Switzerland, please, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Switzerland has taken note of the speech made by AFT International as the host country of a number of international organizations which promote the respect for human rights around the world. Switzerland is also concerned by the fact that religious believers justify certain practices that violate human rights. I'd like to reiterate that the procedures in Switzerland allow for us to determine whether or not a person has a right to protection according to criteria that are recognized by international public law. Thank you.
Thank you. Italy, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I will speak in Italian.
To respond to the questions raised by the Church of Almighty God, the Italian delegation would like to make a few remarks in general, as we do not have the specific information. In order to obtain the status of refugee, one must demonstrate fear of experiencing persecution in one's own country based on the Geneva Conventions. Any subsidiary protection would result from the possibility of the danger of returning to one's country. Now, if the conditions do not exist for recognition, then there would need to be a grave humanitarian reason for requesting asylum. In that event, the person has the right to stay in national territory. The Ministry of the Interior has received more than 37,000 requests for asylum in a recent period, and in the event that there is a negative result following an assessment, based on international norms, the asylum requester is provided with indications for how to appeal the process. A request can be made of the judge for the possibility to remain in Italy during the time of the appeal underway. Italy rigorously applies the provisions of the Geneva Convention and provides all necessary instruments for availing oneself of the right of asylum. Thank you.
Thank you. And last delegation exercising right of reply is Ukraine. Please, you have the floor.
В ответ на заявление
response to the statement of one of the organizations, we draw the attention of the exacerbation with the human rights situation in Russian-occupied Crimea with regard to freedom of religion and confession. During the occupation, the rights of Crimeans were endangered, especially with regard to certain religions. Now, the rights of religions, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses were completely banned in Crimea after the Supreme Court of Russia handed down its decision. In Crimea, the Russian Federation pressures the freedom of religion through administrative and criminal charges. Imams are being exposed. Now, 29 cases against Ukrainian citizens who live in Crimea are facing major sentences. For example, this is the attitude of Russia against religious organizations in Crimea. Hatred, the instigation of hatred, using the language of hatred, propaganda conducted by the Russian Federation in occupied Crimea. Thank you.
Thank you. This now brings us to the end of our session. I'd like to thank very much our speakers today. I would like to thank all of the participants. I would like to thank very much our interpreters. And a few reminders for the next session tomorrow morning. The speakers list is open 1 hour before the session. Please arrive early. The list is closed once the limit of 50 is reached. And only participants with their own badge are able to sign up on the speakers list. Please leave the headset, receiver, headphone in the room. And we welcome you very much to attend the evening side events. Thank you and have a very nice evening.